Welcome to Making Our Way Forward, a podcast where we share compelling life stories and learn from the experience of everyday entrepreneurs. At NACCE, we celebrate diversity and invite you to join the conversation as we talk to entrepreneurs and leaders from all walks of life. We hope that by telling their stories, we bring you inspiration, empower you to take action, and ignite entrepreneurship in your community. Welcome to Making Our Way Forward podcast, where we tell the stories of people doing small and large things around the world to make the world a better place through the lens of entrepreneurship. I am so pleased to bring today our special guest, Jeanelle Austin, who is the Executive Director of the George Floyd Global Memorial. Thank you so much, Jeanelle, for being here today. I can't wait to share your story, the things that you're doing, and importantly, where you're headed with our listeners today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Great. So I have the pleasure of having this be my second conversation with you. And so I learned a little bit about what you're doing with the Global Memorial Project. But I'd like to begin just talking about you and who you are, maybe some experiences in your life that kind of shaped the really big trajectory of where you're headed. So maybe give us a little insight into Jeanelle as we begin here.
Absolutely. And I think it's fascinating that you worded the question that way of the experiences that shaped where I am now, because that's something that I've definitely talked about even with my family about how the different journeys that I've taken over time all play into this role now. So I actually grew up here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, just a few blocks away from where George Floyd was lynched. So George Floyd's memorial is at 38th in Chicago, and my family has lived at 38th in Oakland for over 36 years now. And I actually went to college for Christian ministries out in Pennsylvania at Messiah College, studying global studies because I loved people, I loved cultures, and it was just something that was near and dear to my heart. Then I actually left to go to California in the Los Angeles area to Fuller Theological Seminary, where I earned my Master's of Arts in Intercultural Studies, and then continued my education with a Master's of Divinity in ethics. And so my background and training really is in theology and spirituality. I stayed out in California for a little bit over a decade working, ended up leaving the position of Director of Operations for African American Church Studies at Fuller. And I moved to Austin, Texas, where I started my own company called Racial Agency Initiative, because I wanted to do a new chapter in my life where I was helping people leverage their agency for racial justice and figuring out, how do we pursue racial justice with joy? How do we do it, this walk, in a way where we're not burning out, crashing, falling to pieces? I felt strongly that when people lean into their strengths, and when we are all leaning in with the work and the skills and the talents that we've already been given, there's a way for us in our society to be able to move that needle of racial justice forward without crashing and burning all the time. So I started that work in Austin, Texas, but while I was there, I also spent time really engaging the intersection of health and wellness and racial equity and racial justice. And so that was a new part for me. I had been doing formal, like, racial equity work, racial justice work since 2004. And so, but this was the first time that I actually intentionally I joined an organization called Austin Health Commons, where that was their particular focus was the intersection of health and race. And then I engaged in Dell Med School at the University of Texas at Austin, and became friends with Dr. Jewel Mullen, who was their new associate dean of public health, and really exploring that. And then the pandemic hit. And so all of a sudden we are placed as a society in this position where we are paying attention to health and wellness, but also to the inequities, the racial disparities that are happening. I think the first stats came out in April of 2020, and really paying attention. But at the same time, I was also paying attention to the several cases that we are looking at across the nation of people being killed by the police in different states or by vigilantes. So you had Ahmaud Arbery, you had Breonna Taylor, you had Sean Reed, and so many others. And I remember thinking and feeling to myself, like, man, this is extremely terrible, because in the time of the pandemic, when we're not supposed to be leaving our homes, and the only time you get to leave is like for groceries and once a day to go for a walk, depending on the regulations that were in your city or state. We're still watching this horror of Black people being killed by the police across the nation.
There's so much there. I want to ask you about a couple of the things that you said, and what my experience of you in the short time that I've known you is. You do have a joyful spirit. And I didn't ask you what your background was when we had a conversation yesterday, but I wonder, and I'm thinking maybe some of our listeners are wondering the same thing. Normally, you think of sort of protest and justice issues of sort of being wrapped in a cloak of anger. And there is that, certainly outrage. And one of the things that you shared is really some pillars that guide your work. And, and certainly there's that balance between grief and rage, but there's also joy. And I want to ask you about those pillars, because I think that they sort of encapsulate what you've said about your experience. And we're going to talk a little bit in a minute about the memorial. But why don't you share with us some of those things? Because I was thinking about them after our conversation, and I think people might enjoy hearing about those.
I like to say that there are 5 things that you could find at George Floyd Square at any given moment, any given day, the way in which people are engaging the space. And that is community, liberation, public grief, pilgrimage, and protest. And I think that those 5 things are extremely important in the way in which the community has come together to really shape this space called George Floyd Square, right? Being able to bring people together, build relationships, know who we are, being able to build trust amongst each other, know who our children are, uplift each other, meet each other's needs, that work of really understanding of who is my neighbor and how can I be a neighbor to somebody else, and how can I allow somebody else to be a neighbor to me. Community, liberation. I think liberation comes in many different ways. People are looking for many different things. People have different things that they feel are holding them back and setting them back. And so what does it look like to come to a space where people are seeking and searching for answers on how to be free? And it looks different for different people. But what you find is this pursuit of liberation. And what we would say that the whole movement that we're seeing right now is a movement for Black liberation. Public grief is something that I don't think we find spaces in our country where people can come and just grieve their losses. With my background in pastoral care or training in pastoral care, one of the things that I have grown to understand is that grief in its most basic form is just processing loss, however and whatever that looks like. Sometimes it
Mhm.
looks like dancing and laughing. Sometimes it looks like tears and weeping. Sometimes it looks like silence. And you find people processing grief, and not just the loss of George Floyd, but the loss of so many others in their
Mhm.
lives. In the memorial, I'll find photos of servicemen and women that someone has laid a photo down of their relative and family member. So the ways in which people come to the memorial to process their grief is profound, and that space is big enough to hold all of our grief in almost a very deep, spiritual, and miraculous way. Then there's a pilgrimage. People come from all over the world to process, to pilgrim to George Floyd Square, and then protest. It's a place of protest. It started as a place of protest on May 26th, after the lynching of George Floyd. And so many of the offerings that people have laid down are an extension of their protest. And so the protest never really leaves that space. So as long as we continue to keep the stories uplifted and the stories told, the way in which people engage even the art that's in that space, art is one of the most powerful forms of protest, a friend once told me. And so being able to engage all the ways that people have expressed themselves, I like to call it creative expressions of pain and hope. Those are first and foremost acts of protest. And we acknowledge that and uphold that at George Floyd Square.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think, in sort of my experience, and I can share with you a little bit about my pilgrimage to the George Floyd Memorial. I did not go by myself. I went with a couple of colleagues that are good friends of mine, and I didn't know what to expect. And I watched on the news and I watched that horrible, horrible video. And I remember because I couldn't sleep that night. I couldn't get it out of my head. And I didn't know what that experience would feel like for me, being a white person, a white woman coming from North Carolina that shares many of the same values and things that you expressed earlier. And I wondered, would I get into that space and start crying? What would it be like? And I want you to describe some of the beautiful art in a moment, but I can tell you when I got there with my friends from NACCE, it was like 90 degrees. It was hot. And the first thing that struck me as I walked in was the sculpture, which was a hand, which to me, I experienced justice and it scared me a little bit, not frightened me, but it was not what I expected. And as I walked into the place, my experience was much like you described it. All of a sudden, I saw some beautiful art and I saw some flowers growing, not dead flowers that make you sad at a memorial, but somebody was tending to this garden, and it wasn't a carefully manicured garden. It had all kinds of different plants and flowers and expressions. And so we just sort of walked around, and part of my experience, I told you this yesterday, I met two young men. They were just, smiling, and they had t-shirts on, and they had a box of t-shirts, and they introduced themselves as young entrepreneurs, which in the business I'm in, like that was just, music to my ears, because a lot of people don't see themselves as entrepreneurs at all. And my friend that was with me, we were just like scrounging through our pockets in our purse. They weren't taking credit cards of, this is the money that we have. And we bought t-shirts and we brought them back. But to me, it was the juxtaposition, I think, of hope and grief and loss and opportunity. And we went into the shop to get a glass of iced tea across from the Cup Foods. And the people in there took care of us. We were so hot. They gave us a cold drink, and we sat there, and I was reflecting on that and thinking about our relationship now with you, Jeanelle, that you are going to be our guide as we are in Minneapolis for NACCE's National Conference that has happened in early October. And you're training guides from the neighborhood, young people who are, part of the neighborhood that you came from, to, lead other people through that experience. And it just is something I'm still trying to process and get my head around. But I want you to, if you can, share with us a little bit about the art that people will see at the memorial, And maybe secondly, about the guides and how do you guide someone through that experience? I went through it, with a couple other people myself, but I'm wondering what that experience you envision that to be with your guides. And I understand you are a guide yourself, sort of the lead guide.
I more so identify as a caretaker. And there are different roles in which people in our community engage based off of their strengths and their skill set and their background and how they chose to lean into community. For myself, I chose to lean in as a caretaker, someone who tends to the space. And I do that as my form of protest. And even with the offerings that people have laid down, I tend to not call it art, but creative expressions of pain and hope. Because I think that the way in our society in which we understand art, sometimes we bend towards this kind of consumeristic pattern. And so what does it look like to engage the space, again, as a space of protest where people are expressing their pain, where people are expressing their grief? And so everywhere you turn and everywhere you look at George Floyd Square, you will see some kind of creative expression. Now, I want to start with that garden because you mentioned the garden that surrounds the fist in the middle of the intersection. Now, that garden last summer had been planted in a very organized way with certain plants that were on certain sides of the garden. And then we went through winter and we turned down that garden, and then came the spring. And many of the plants that were actually given as offerings last summer that we preserved through building a greenhouse as a community were replanted then into the garden this spring and this summer. And so there's so many different plants there, and it's not as curated. It's not as manicured because it's so many different people's expressions of their offering to the space. And so when you come to George Floyd Square in the center of the intersection, you will see a major garden with a fist sculpture in the middle. Now, the original fist was actually made of wood, and the artist had placed it in the middle of the street, sort of kind of in front of where the greenhouse is now, or where Chicago Avenue Fire Arts Center is. And then within like 3 days, the community had lifted up the fist and walked it to the center of the intersection there. And then the garden was built around it. Now, the community had then asked for a fist that would be casted in copper or in some kind of metal that would last for a long time. And so the artist came back and constructed a hand as a replacement installation while he worked on building a metal fist. And so that hand was extremely controversial. And I called him and I said, hey, how fast can we get the fist back? Because people really want the fist, because it was an open hand versus a closed fist. And we actually ended up installing the current fist, which is a steel structure, on Martin Luther King Day this year in January 2021. Now, what was so fascinating about that installation is we didn't use any cranes. We used only people power. So we had about 30 people working together to install this iron fist. And it was such a community building experience. And so that fist represents more than just the symbol of liberation as it has done historically, but it also represents our community and kind of a trust exercise to actually do something together that would mean something significant for all of us. When you come to George Floyd Square, you'll also see the blue mural that was built within days of George Floyd's death or painted. But that's a controversial mural because it was started by white artists, and Black artists weren't invited into the project initially. And so we had to do a whole restorative justice process around that and hold forums between Black artists and the original artists to discuss like where the point of pain was and the ways in which whiteness took up space in a movement for Black liberation. But you'll also see the painting by Peyton Scott Russell, which is a Black and white mural, 12 by 12 foot, of how he was expressing himself and expressing his pain and his anger and his rage. at the time of the uprising. You'll see the mourning passage, which is a list of 168 names written on the streets, painted on the streets by one of our community artists, Miss Mari. You'll see Say Their Names memorial. It looks like a cemetery, and it's an installation that is designed to humanize people. And so it has the names, the dates of death, the locations of death, and the ages of people when they died. And so you get a sense of not just of what their name is, but how old were they when they died? How long has this been happening? Because you'll see dates that are 2020 or 2021, but then you'll see dates that are far back as the 1950s. And so that is something that I think is significant and important to realize, that this didn't start with George Floyd and it didn't end with George Floyd. And then also you'll see like little tiny offerings, even like little rocks that are painted, and things like a bicycle helmet or a pair of sunglasses, whatever people found that was close to them that they wanted to lay down as an offering, they laid down. And our role as caretakers is to keep and preserve their offering, because everything is somebody's offering, we say, and therefore nothing is thrown away. And we'd like to honor that.
Tell us about your experience in California. I understand you spent a number of years working in higher ed. And so share what that was like, and what did you learn, and how did that inform your work?
I actually, when I graduated grad school, I actually started a position as an academic advisor for master's students in the intercultural studies program. And I thought I was giving a 2-year commitment and ended up staying for 7 years. And that position was extremely formational in terms of me learning how to work with people, learning how to listen to people, understand the different needs and goals, life goals that people have, and how to walk with people, how to achieve those goals. And I think that so many ways as a caretaker right now, the way I'm able to meet people and listen to people, and help them process whatever it is that they're going through, and provide ideas and insights on next steps that they can take. Oftentimes I get asked the question, well, what can I do? Right. And that is a common question that students ask when they're trying to figure out how to go through school. What can I do? What should I do? Help me. And so I think that experience as an academic advisor was definitely formational for this work. When I finished my second master's, I decided that I wanted to go back to school for sociology, because I always loved sociology. And I decided to go to the local community college, Pasadena Community College. And I enrolled and took sociology classes, but I also took building construction classes, because I have this fetish with all of these like house flipping shows on TV.
Oh, me too.
And I wanted to actually learn, how is it really done, instead of just assuming that I know how to do it because I've watched it on TV. So I went to community college to study that. And then I also took as well some psychology courses, which I think has been extremely helpful in this space where we're navigating a community that has been traumatized by the experience of George Floyd being lynched, but also by multiple layers of life experiences that have layered trauma with people. And so I think my experience at community college, it was actually deeply formational for this moment in time that I'm in. And I'm really grateful for that experience.
And so you and I have another connection. I'm actually the daughter of a sociologist. My dad, David O'Brien, just recently retired from the University of Missouri, but that was his lifelong passion. He did that work for half of a century. And one of the things he did just recently, because he hasn't stopped working, although he's not working full time, is he published a book called Defining Public Good. And it's all about sort of how do you embrace communities in decline, and what is the responsibility for that. So I just when you shared that, it just resonated with me, because even in his book, he talked about community colleges, because of course he has to listen to me talk about them all the time, because I love community colleges and the role that they play. So we have talked about so many things, and I can't wait to spend more time with you, more time in the memorial. Let us know, Jeanelle, too, if people want to learn more about it, if they want to support the work. You'd mentioned the campaign a little bit earlier. How do they find out about you? How do they get in touch with your organization?
Absolutely. You can come to our website at www.georgefloydglobalmemorial.org. Also, you can follow us on social media at GFG Memorial. So that's our handle for all social media accounts, is GFG Memorial. And so we love people to be able to also share their photos and tag us so we can see and witness your experience in the memorial as well, and uplift the stories and the experiences that you had. So that's also a way to stay in relationship with us, is by sharing your photos and letting us know that you've been here.
That's beautiful. And it's really interesting to me. I did not know who you were when we were there, but I felt that sense of everything that you described, of the spirit, and I felt so safe there. I can't even describe why. Sometimes you go to a city where you're not familiar, you've never been there before, but I think that what you have done is really created an experience that's going to grow. It's going to touch people, and I look forward to seeing you, Jeanelle, just change the world. You are clearly, I would call you a spiritual entrepreneur. That's a new combination, but I think your leadership helping people not only process and heal, but knowing that it's a very imperfect process, right? Like the garden, plants are going to kind of go where they want to go, right? We can trim them back. But there's something very resilient. One of the themes of the NACCE conference this year and a future building summit, which hopefully you will join us for on Wednesday, is really focused on building for the future. And I would love, as we close out here, for you to share with us something that you're both hopeful about and something that you aspire to see in this solemn, beautiful place that you are doing such a wonderful job taking care of.
I am extremely, extremely hopeful about the way in which these offerings that have been laid through over time. It's a living memorial, so people keep giving offerings. And so we keep our commitment to preserve and conserve those offerings at the George Floyd Global Memorial. And when I look at what people have offered and given, when I look at how people have expressed themselves, when I look at what people have written, sometimes people write letters, sometimes people write poems, sometimes people paint paintings or create crafts. I see the power in these actual offerings to help us heal. And my hope then, and something that I am extremely excited about, is when we get to that day where we can actually break ground and build a brick and mortar building to actually house all of these offerings and house this collection together, so people can come in and walk through a remembering experience and recall what happened, that they will feel the power of these offerings. They sing like a 10-part chorus of justice. They sing a 10-part chorus of healing. They sing a 10-part chorus of community and liberation and public grief and pilgrimage and protest, that I think that they will invite the world onto this journey of how do we push ourselves to actually pursue racial justice. And so that is something that I am hopeful for, that these offerings will be a key that unlocks a major healing journey for us here in Minneapolis, but also really throughout our country as people come to visit and witness for themselves.
That is so powerful, what you just said. And, it's really healing the world, right? Everything's been disrupted. Lives have been lost, communities are torn apart, but then we have people like you that are taking those pieces and reassembling them and making something beautiful out of it. So I want to thank you so much for sharing your story. We are thinking about George Floyd today and his family and his life and what it meant. And October 14th, his birthday, and imagine, him coming into the world. Who would have known the mission, that he was sent probably from above to accomplish. So just real quick, I know October 14th is another important day for you as the executive director. So maybe just share with us quickly what October 14th, 2020 was.
Absolutely. October 14th, 2020 is the day that Miss Angela Harrelson and Miss Paris Stevens, who are co-chairs of the board of the George Floyd Global Memorial, decided to launch in honor of George Floyd. And so in 2021, in October 14th, we turned one. So we are excited that it is our first birthday and that we made it 1 year. And we made it 1 year because of the people, both the way in which the people built the memorial, but also the way in which people have given. Last year we had launched a $1 million donor campaign that we continue to uplift. And we set the minimum donation at $1. And the reason why we did that is because in the memorial, you will find offerings from even little children. Even if it's just like an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper with scribblings of red marker, just trying to process their grief. And we sat down and we said, you know what? Anybody of any age should be able to give and be a founding donor and a founding member of the George Floyd Global Memorial. This is the People's Memorial. And so we said, hey, as low as $1 you can give and become one of 1 million donors to start the George Floyd Global Memorial. So we are totally of and for and by the people. And so we continue to grow and we continue to watch people give out of their generosity, regardless of their social status in life. And I think that that's just a huge reflection of the people who built the memorial and the people who continue to build us as the George Floyd Global Memorial. So we made it 1 year because of the people, and we are forever grateful. And we look forward to a second year celebration next year.
Yeah, you've only just begun, as they say. And I know NACCE is really pleased to support that campaign. We have something special to present to you. And I just want to thank you for being here. Thank you for being the person that you are. Thank you to our listeners around the world. Everybody have a good day and make the world a better place. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. We hope that listening to this podcast will help you to explore the many ways we might define entrepreneurship. Join us every other Wednesday for more episodes as we celebrate opportunity, learn from one another, and grow together. Subscribe to this podcast, connect with us on social media, and learn more about today's speakers at nacce.com/podcast. We look forward to making our way forward together with you.
Have you heard about our latest book, Impact Ed? How Community College Entrepreneurship Creates Equity and Prosperity? This is our roadmap for building back better in 50 states and globally. In each chapter, we share the inspiring stories of everyday entrepreneurs and explain how community colleges play a crucial role in their success. Visit us at nacce.com/impacted to order your copy now and join us in this work.